Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Arundel House. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. It's my great pleasure to chair this session. I am John Raine. I am Senior Advisor for Geopolitical Due Diligence. I've been looking forward immensely to chairing this session. Our guest speaker is Nigel Gould-Davies. A few words of introduction to spare Nigel's blushes. Nigel, most importantly, will shortly be joining IISS, so we're delighted to have him aboard. He has an unusually wide optic on his area of expertise, having been an academic and a teacher at universities Oxford, Harvard, in Myanmar and Thailand, also a diplomat, including a stint as the UK ambassador to Belarus, and in the private sector as Vice President for British Gas Group, focusing on Central Asia. Nigel is also, as many of you will know, a well-established and respected commentator and publisher. In addition to his many publications on Russia and Central Asia, Nigel has also recently published a book on the wider subject of geopolitical risk, entitled Global Political Risk in an Age of Transformation, Tectonic Politics. I promised Nigel I'd give a small puff for his book, but I do that happily. Perhaps more germane to this afternoon, Nigel authored recently an article in the latest edition of Survival, which I commend to you, on Russia, the West and sanctions, and he will be speaking both on that theme this afternoon and its wider application to all those countries who are subject to sanctions, and some comments, I think, on what he describes as the broader theme of economic statecraft. So Nigel has kindly agreed to talk for about half an hour and then take questions. Nigel.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction. Thank you all for coming this afternoon and braving this rather grim weather. Thank you also, John, for mentioning my book, Tectonic Politics. The week after it was published, Amazon told me it got into the top 20 books about volcanoes and earthquakes. It shows that Amazon's algorithms aren't going to take over the world just yet. So I'd like to offer a few thoughts and share some views this afternoon on the subject of Western sanctions and Russia's future. I think this is a timely moment to offer thoughts on this. Next month will be the 6th anniversary of the annexation of Crimea, which was the first event to trigger the wave of sanctions that we've seen since then. We've also just seen the latest Munich Security Conference, at which President Macron once again called for an improvement of relations with Russia and cast doubt on the wisdom of the current sanctions regime. So there are questions about the potential future of that regime, voices of dissent within the West now, at least some. So these issues are being debated. Recent events have also reminded us this is a moving target, that the whole question of the development of sanctions is very much something in motion. Early this week, the American Treasury imposed sanctions on the trading arm of Rosneft. This is a company responsible for around 40% of Russia's oil production, 6% of global production. Now I emphasize on the trading arm, not on the production, but still it shows the potential for further escalation of sanctions. We also see very much in play the latest American draft bill, the so-called DASCA bill, Defending American Security Against Kremlin Aggression Act, which would, if passed in anything like its current form, mark a further significant escalation in several aspects of the sanctions regime. Now, I mentioned this is the 6th anniversary impending of the new world of sanctions that Russia and the West have come to live in. 6 years, actually, in the scheme of sanctions regimes is not that long. So compare for the longer periods on which sanctions were imposed on Iraq in the 1990s, and more recently on Iran for 10 years, before that regime eventually gave way to the now ill-fated, I suppose, JCPOA. So 6 years is less of a period. On what I'll argue in a moment is a much, much harder, in fact, uniquely challenging sanctions target that we have in Russia. But I think 6 years is not too soon to begin to draw some conclusions, at least identify some emerging contours of implications for these sanctions for Russia's development and its potential future. I'll just offer the thought also that these sanctions are especially significant, I think, for a number of wider reasons. One is that Western sanctions since 2014 mark the first time since the end of the Cold War that the West has sought to deprive Russia of important benefits of access to the global economy rather than facilitate and encourage Russia's integration. That's a very significant shift of overall approach. Even as the larger Russian-Western political and security relationship declined in the previous decade, the West, in principle and also in practice, continued to encourage Russia's integration, for example, supporting WTO accession in 2011 and 2012, and other measures too. So this is marks a sharp change in the Western approach. More generally, one might argue that this marks the first time ever that the West has become the most significant barrier to Russia's access to the global economy. These, of course, are not the first sanctions the West has ever imposed on Russia or the Soviet Union. That was certainly true in the Cold War, for example. But in Cold War times, of course, the Soviet Union was a command economy, fundamentally had little interest in any systematic integration with the capitalist enemy. The fundamental limitations on the extent of Russia's or the Soviet integration into the world economy were defined by Soviet ideology and system rather than Western sanctions. Western sanctions there were, of course, but when the Soviet Union came to seek Western loans, grain exports and the like, largely speaking, they got what they wanted. So this is the first time the West has been the most important source of constraint on Russia's access to the global capital and technology in particular. Secondly, this, the other side of the coin, marks a significant shift for Russia, which has now had to begin to adapt to a world in which it's deprived of certain important benefits of access to Western technology and capital in particular. It's had to adapt, adjust to that, and that has accelerated, I think, a shift in the Kremlin's worldview. Indeed, in some respects, one of the most significant changes that we've seen in Putin's approach to international relations is his approach to globalization. Go back to the early 2000s, Putin was a strong advocate of Russia's deeper integration into the global economy. Soviet autarky of Cold War times has been the aspect of Soviet practice about which Putin has perhaps been less nostalgic than any other. And yet now Russia finds itself in a position of being deprived of the potential for deeper globalization, a rhetoric of reliance on Russia itself, on autonomy and on import substitution, now very strikingly replacing the earlier openness to forms of globalization, albeit always carefully constrained and defined by Putin's own domestic political project. And thirdly, I think the significance of these sanctions lies also in the fact that Russia today is the biggest economy ever to be subject to major peacetime sanctions. The nearest counterpart would be Japan, perhaps in 1940, 1941. This is the biggest economy, and more generally, I'd argue, the hardest, the toughest target that sanctions ever faced, not only with respect to Russia's sheer size and the resilience to external economic shock that brings, but also the fact that Russia, of course, is systemically important to global energy markets. Global energy markets, and particularly to EU gas supply. Russia still supplies around 40% of the EU's gas needs. That means that what is potentially a vulnerability, and a sanctionable vulnerability, Russia's own dependence on those hydrocarbon revenues, in practice is not something that can be directly and specifically targeted by sanctions. Possible to simply say no to Russia's oil and gas supply in the way that it was possible to do so with Iran and Iraq and other smaller hydrocarbon providers. This uniquely difficult sanctions target has required innovation and evolution in the thinking of and design in sanctions instruments against Russia. So I'd just like to briefly say a little bit about how those sanctions have evolved and more about those themes of escalation and innovation. A little bit about how Russia has changed so far in response to this new and unwelcome world of sanctions. The themes here are response and the impact on Russia. And then say something about the underlying policy question. What have been the political effects that we can discern so far on Russia? What are good and bad tests of assessing those effects, that impact? And finally, what are the implications for Russia's choices and for Western strategy that follow from this? So, just to remind ourselves of the key phases that have marked the evolution and escalation of sanctions on Russia. I think we can identify three distinct phases. The first is the immediate post-2014 development in response to the initial annexation of Crimea, the intervention in eastern Ukraine, the shooting down of MH17. These were sanctions that were, in the first instance, quite limited in impact, deemed and explicitly articulated as reversible. So if the argument and the statements that accompanied these sanctions said that if Russia were to comply, in particular the Minsk agreements, then these sanctions would be removed. There's an explicit sense of the reversibility of these sanctions. There was early awareness of the challenges of trying to sanction a target as difficult as Russia, and innovation in the forms of the new sectoral sanctions identification, a form of sanction that never really existed before on entire sectors, the finance, on energy, but not on all the companies or on every aspect of company activities in these sectors. Certain specific restrictions on access to finance, access to technology, which are tightened over time. But that was a form of sanction that was quite new, devised, invented specifically to do with Russia. The second of the three phases in the evolution of sanctions was the CAATSA Act, the Countering Americans' Adversaries Through Sanctions Act of 2017. It's marked a significant American escalation of sanctions against Russia, and in new and different and important ways from what had preceded it. These sanctions began to acquire secondary force, which meant that they were applicable not only to American entities and individuals, but threatened any entities or individuals around the world who violated these sanctions with retaliatory sanctions in turn. So we begin to see the formidable harnessing and application of America's structural power as the possessor of the global reserve currency, the dollar, very significantly globally applying sanctions to anyone who might consider violating them. The CAATSA measures were responses not specifically to Ukrainian measures, but to a much wider suite of Russian activities. Cyber interference and the hacking associated with the 2016 election, of course, and the congressional concerns that generated, but also a series of other actions too. Russian involvement in Syria, for example, human rights violations. There was a large number of pretexts in that bill to which sanctions were a response. Part of CAATSA mandated the Treasury to produce a report identifying the wealthiest individuals around Putin. There was some embarrassment when, at the last minute, that mandated requirement was met by what looked like a cut and paste, essentially, of the Forbes rich list. But you might recall But the significance of that requirement should not be lost. There was a survey of notice by the Congress of a readiness to consider a broader range of sanctions against individuals around the Kremlin, around Putin, who themselves were not state officials, not directly responsible for either the making or the implementation of policy. They're simply very rich people close to the Kremlin. The significance of that became clearer during the third and I think so our final wave of sanctions, the post-Salisbury nerve agent attack sanctions. I recall the attack on the Skripals in March of 2018. A series of measures by Britain, by the United States in particular, in response to that. Most spectacularly, the April the 6th designations, very significant further set of Treasury actions in response to, again, the pretext was broader than ever, a pattern of malign activity around the world. And in particular, the specific measure to sanction 24 major figures, 7 of whom were so-called oligarchs. In particular, Deripaska and Vekselberg. The choosing of those two individuals, the significance of that was not confined to the targeting. The determination to begin to imply very significant financial measures against wealthy individuals not directly involved in policy making served notice on the broader swathe of oligarchs that they potentially could be targeted in due course. So there was a disruptive, anxiety-provoking impact that measure created. Those targets were very largely, and in some cases their companies too, cut off from access to the global financial system. This represented the use of some very, very potent American Treasury financial instruments, honed after 9/11 to target terrorist and other criminal groups, and then smaller states like North Korea and Iran, to private wealthy individuals in a much larger state. Significant escalation in sanctions practice. Britain, in the meantime, began to develop a new set of policies and practices also aimed at hindering the access of wealthy private individuals in Russia and also elsewhere to UK financial services. A significant case in point was the delay in granting Roman Abramovich a visa, forcing him to take out Israeli citizenship. Some of you will recall that. The parliamentary decision over government objections at the time to require the overseas territories to create beneficiary share registries, unexplained wealth orders, other measures like that. So in all these respects, we begin to see something new and significant, a more concerted attempt to challenge ease of access to Western financial services. I'll say more about where I believe the significance of that may lie in a moment. But the big picture then, if we go back over the past 6 years, has been an escalation along many dimensions of the sanctions regime against Russia. Escalation or broadening in the range of reasons and pretexts for its application, an expansion in the range of targets that have been selected, an increase in the severity of the measures applied, and a lengthening of the implicit time horizon of their application, from initial measures which were limited and specific and reversible to a range of measures now responding to a pattern of malign activity around the world. And if we have rhetoric of that breadth and vagueness, it becomes harder and harder to contemplate, even define the specific circumstances in which they might be lifted. We've moved into a world where sanctions have increasingly become an instrument of choice in the West's response to Russia's unacceptable actions. And that's, I think, a new and significant development. What are the impacts then? What can we say about the ways that this has influenced or shaped or affected Russia? This is something that we can only really understand if we look also at Russia's responses to these sanctions. So Russia, as a large and resilient target, has an unusually broad range of ways in which it can respond to the sanctions imposed upon it. And I think there are four that we can say something about. The first is evasion, of course. All sanctions targets seek to evade sanctions by persuading, wittingly or unwittingly, partners to violate them. Russia's enjoyed very little success here. Even the Chinese have been deterred from engaging in relationships that are potentially sanctionable. Everyone fears, in particular, the prospect of falling under American secondary sanctions. Again, this was a potent structural instrument that's being honed ever more keenly in recent years. Russia is beginning, in partnership with some other countries, to try to create mechanisms of crypto payment that would make illicit transactions harder to identify and therefore sanction. And Russia has also been trying to create a local version of the SWIFT international payments mechanism that would also be sanctions-proof. Still works in progress, but this reminds us that the world of sanctions, as with any other form of foreign policy instrument, is a matter of measure and countermeasure. And we are seeing the escalation of an arms race, if you like, sanctions instruments and counter-sanctions measures. And we're certainly not at the end of that road yet. We are likely to see an escalation on both sides of that race as a consequence of these developments. The second of the responses that Russia has fashioned to sanctions is to try to seek unsanctioned alternatives. So, in particular, to seek new partners that might provide the capital and the technology deprived it by Western measures. In particular, in Asia, and above all, although not only from China. And I think here, broadly speaking, although Russia has managed to form some alternative arrangements here, we see more a sense of disappointment and even disillusionment, especially in respect of early hopes that China might come and enter the fray and provide capital that now the West no longer does. I think there's increasingly a sobering understanding now that China is willing to play a very tough game indeed in respect of things like energy pricing and the terms on which it enters into energy projects in pursuit of Chinese interests. It's nie za krasive глаза, so to speak, not for the sake of Russia's beautiful eyes, that China engages in relationships with it, but in order to pursue specific Chinese interests. There are, on the ground, underlying constraints and limitations in the character of Russia's own domestic regulation that make it inherently hard for China to establish a consistently deeper relationship with Russia. So I think I at least am more impressed by the constraints and limitations on the development of that economic relationship rather than the extent to which it has developed, especially in terms of Chinese investments, which remain very, very low, really globally insignificant in China. A third strategy of response from Russia has been retaliation, in particular in the form of import restrictions on Western foodstuffs. This has been costly to Russian consumers to the tune of about $7 billion or so. It's stoked food price inflation in Russia as well, and if inflation is the cruelest tax, then food price inflation is surely the cruelest tax, because it's the one that disproportionately hurts the poorest people. So that has been a boost, of course, via import substitution to domestic producers, but it has not achieved the political effects intended by Russia in respect of weakening Western resolve or determination to maintain its own sanctions on Russia. In that respect, I think these counter-sanctions have failed to disrupt the united Western sanctions front against Russia. And finally, fourthly, and most significantly, Russia domestically has sought to adapt and adjust its own policies in order to mitigate the impact of sanctions. This has involved establishing an even larger state role to rescue and protect vulnerable sectors, especially banking. Over 60% of the Russian banking sector is now under state control. It has also involved very strong degree of fiscal conservatism, very, very large significant surpluses and reserves, in particular to protect Russia against the prospect of more significant, severe future financial sanctions. It's been a sense of battening down the hatches and protecting Russia, trying to make Russia less vulnerable from further sanctions. Remarkable fact, the budget clearing oil price in Russia has something like halved in the last 3 years. It's a remarkable sort of structural adjustment from around $100 to less than $50. It's really a very striking fiscal tightening. And Russia has also taken steps to try to de-dollarize aspects of its economy, especially its reserves and also some of the payments mechanisms it's established with other countries, especially with Russia. Immediately after the April 2018 sanctions, Russia sold around 80% of its treasury bonds. Again, efforts to limit Russia's vulnerability to future financial sanctions. But adaptation is not a free lunch. It imposes costs of its own. In particular, a larger state means a less efficient and candidly a more corrupt political economy. Fiscal conservatism means even lower growth for Russia. And the search for new partners in Asia means increasingly that Russia is a demandeur in respect of its relationship with China in particular. So I think that in a sense China has been a winner of this, able to move the terms of its relationship with Russia more favourably towards China, certainly than Russia would wish. The net effects then, again, it's important to think about what counts as a good or a bad test of sanctions' impact. No, the Russian economy has not collapsed, but that was never the intention or the hope or the aspiration of these sanctions. The intention the belief was never that it was possible to impose acute and severe pain on an economy as large and resilient as Russia. More a matter of cumulative chronic costs increasing over time. And I think what we've already begun to see is as access to Western technologies and finance have become increasingly restricted, costs in terms of productivity, in terms of growth potential, growing isolation, indeed a feeling of isolation of Russia from the global economy. Several major projects of Western partners had to be suspended in the last 4 years. Foreign investment has fallen very, very sharply and not really recovered. Capital outflows have increased significantly as well. So again, the story here is not acute shock, but chronic and deepening relative decline. This is something that is stoking growing concern within Russia itself, among many audiences, policy audiences, officials who differ on most issues among themselves share this concern. Alexei Kudrin, for example, and Nikolai Patrushev both expressed concern. So a prominent economic liberal and a dean, if you like, of the Siloviki have both in different ways expressed worry about the long-term impact of these sanctions on Russia's prospects. At a mass level too, polling data suggests there's been a jump in popular concern on the impact of sanctions. About 28% to 43% now of Russians say that they are worried about the effect of sanctions. And just some latest polling data from the Levada Center, respected polling center, out literally 2 days ago. I think very, very interesting. So this shows that since 2017, so the last 3 years, the proportion of ordinary Russians who say they believe that Russia should be a partner or a friend of the West has increased from 50% to 78%. The proportion of Russians now who believes that Russia should be an enemy of the West is 3%. These are striking figures. So I mean, think to some of the tests and some of the arguments about sanctions. Do they promote, does a firm Western position promote a rallying round the flag effect? Does it boost Putin's domestic popularity? Possibly it did, 2014, 2015, the height of Krim nashism, the sort of post-Crimean fervour. I don't think anymore. I think we're into different territory here. There's some very interesting results. So finally then, some of the political effects. What have sanctions achieved? What could they reasonably be expected to have achieved? Well, one goal of any policy instrument is something called compellence, to persuade a state to reverse actions, particularly significant and major actions that it has undertaken. These sanctions were never intended to do that. And yes, again, you get these slightly cartoonish tests. Look, Russia still controls Crimea, Russia is still intervening in eastern Ukraine, therefore sanctions aren't working. Sanctions are never intended to achieve those goals. Forcing a state to reverse major decisions is always the hardest thing for any instrument to do. And because an instrument can't do everything, doesn't mean it cannot do nothing. Yes, sanctions were intended to shape the incentives and interests of Russia, to encourage it to reach agreements that would resolve some of the things that it has been doing in Ukraine, in particular full and effective implementation of the Minsk II agreements. And Russia has not done that. There is still a sense in which Russia is willing to bear the current costs of sanctions in order to maintain its position there. So to that extent, in respect of the most difficult tasks that sanctions did set themselves, but those have not yet been achieved. Indeed, we've seen an upsurge in violence and fighting in eastern Ukraine literally in the last few days. Deterrence. Can sanctions persuade Russia not to exacerbate its involvement, not to escalate its own activities? There may be different views on this, but the evidence that I've seen and the things that people have shared with me has suggested that at certain important moments, particularly early on, 2014, 2015, the threat of much more severe sanctions, especially on Russia's access to the SWIFT international payment system, did encourage Russian restraint, did persuade it not to move, for example, on Mariupol in September 2014. So I believe the balance evidence there. We won't know for sure until the archives are open, but I do believe there is a sense in which Russia has been deterred on certain important occasions there. Sanctions have reaffirmed norms, I think, quite powerfully. They have sustained a collective international view that certain actions are simply unacceptable, gross violations of sovereignty above all. Few buy into the Russian narratives on Crimea or indeed on Salisbury, and the extent of that solidarity was impressively demonstrated by the coordinated expulsion of 150 diplomats soon after the Salisbury affair. But just as a final thought, I want to, in a more speculative mode, point to something that I believe could potentially prove one of the more significant longer-term impacts of sanctions, and that's the effect of some of the most significant sanctions measures, those imposed since 2018, on some of the Russian economic elites, and the broader demonstration effect that they have revealed to Russian elites, that they are vulnerable to deprivation of access to the global financial system. This is the impact then of sanctions on Russian elites. Major wealth holders in Russia. It is very rare in any system in the world for those who hold enormous amounts of wealth to have their interests ignored or overridden systematically. What it means to be an elite is that you can, to some degree, ensure that your core interests are respected and preserved. So how might that work in Russia? Consider the position of the major wealth holders in Russia. It's been a tumultuous journey. They're very, very dominant in the 1990s, colonized the state and the implementation of law, cowed by Putin from the early 2000s onwards, and very rapidly as well And under Putin, the so-called oligarchs and others like them have become much weaker, more dependent on Putin, but much wealthier as a consequence. In addition to that, and I think most significantly, they've become more dependent on the West, even as Russia itself has become more adversarial in its behavior towards the West. And it's this dependence on the West that I just want to draw attention to. It's a truth about Russia, but a truth about many authoritarian systems more generally, that wealth is preserved and protected through a form of oligarchic arbitrage. The making of money, the making of wealth, through the rule of relationships in an authoritarian state, and the preserving and protecting of that wealth by sending it to places where the rule of law prevails. So oligarchic arbitrage from authoritarian systems to either offshore systems or Western countries where it's safe to send and keep your wealth. So that the wealth protection services made available by Western countries provide an essential sort of stabilizing function to authoritarian systems, helping to keep their elites happy. And for the first time now, in the case of Russia, this reassurance that it's possible to send vast amounts of money overseas and to have it protected and kept safe, that bargain, that relationship, that arrangement is beginning to be called into question. You have someone like Abramovich burnished his reputation in the early 2000s, converted his wealth, part of his wealth, into reputation by buying Chelsea. Others like him, Vexelberg is another case in point, Fabergé eggs and so on. They've worked hard to invest in relationships and acceptance in the West. Now, they can no longer now be sure, have the confidence that that arrangement will continue. It's early days yet, but I think it's worth considering a scenario, a prospect, where the sanctions that target them and restrict their essential access to these services, those measures become escalated and increasingly force them to rethink where their core interests lie. How will they respond to that? Could a critical mass of the very wealthy come to the conclusion that their core interest in access to Western financial protection services is challenged, is threatened by Western actions taken in response to aggressive Russian measures? As the 2024 question begins to loom across everything on the Russian political horizon, and as too the biggest intergenerational transfer of wealth ever in the history of the world begins to loom, these oligarchs and others who acquired this enormous wealth want to bequest it safely and reliably to their children. That's one of the key tasks that they've now set themselves. As these concerns become ever more dominant in their thinking, they will draw, or may draw, their own conclusions about the implications for them of an aggressive Russian policy, which in effect threatens their access to Western systems and Western services. And it's not just a matter of the oligarchs. One might argue, yes, the oligarchs were once important, but now they're not. They've been cowed. They had their moment in the 1990s. But Russia has reverted to type. Russia has always been essentially about a service, nobility, or a nomenclatura class. The private wealth holders will no longer have independent influence on Russian policies. Not only the oligarchs that make use of access to Western systems of wealth protection. State elites, much more generally, avail themselves of access to the West's rule of law to protect their wealth. So I think we're on potentially the dawn of a situation where a new world for elites, if Western policy, sanctions policy, tightens and hardens, where they are faced with new dilemmas, new and unsettling dilemmas that they have never had to face before. And again, this is not just true of Russia, it's a structural fact about the West's relationship with much of the non-West. So we've just had the Munich Security Conference. Westlessness was the slogan, the key term devised for that conference. So it's worth asking, in light of the rhetoric of Westlessness, what the West's comparative advantage lies in, what defines its relationship with the rest of the world. And again, it seems to me that part of the answer to that question is the West, and only the West, provides the facilities, the systems, the services that authoritarian, non-Western elites make use of, and in some important sense need. And it seems to me that that dependence of the non-West on the West ought to be a key part of any future Western security thinking and security policy. Finally then, if we begin to move into a world where the most important sanctions are sanctions that deprive Russian and possibly other elites of access to Western financial services and wealth protection, then the Western countries themselves will need to reform themselves. They will need to raise their standards of transparency, of probity, in the examination of the flows, the enormous flows that come into their systems. So it requires further domestic reform as well as external sanctions. So I just offer that as a final speculation. And I think I will leave it there. There's more to say on all of these questions, but I hope that's given some sort of provocation for thought. I look forward to your thoughts and questions and comments. Thank you.
Nigel, thank you very much. That was excellent, particularly thoughtful, insightful, both narrative of how we got into this position with Russia and analysis of its consequences. I liked, in particular, your comments about how this attacks the nomenclature model and that jurisdictional arbitrage which has kept too many regimes of an essentially distasteful nature afloat is one indeed that's ripe for review. So thank you for all of that. I'm sure many of you have questions. Yes, Europe.
Jonathan Isle from Russie. I wonder, first of all, I would say this was one of the best presentations I've heard on the topic. I wish it could be translated into French and dispatched to the Élysée back to but I wonder if I could tease from you one element which you mentioned, which is one of the subsidiary arguments of Mr. Macron in Munich, also in his speeches in France, which is that the sanctions not merely fail, as he put it, but actually push Russia towards China. The Russian weakness, which supposedly is there, despite the fact that sanctions failed, but logic is not entirely flawless here, but the Russian weakness is pushing Russia towards China. Now, you mentioned the cautious attitude of China on the subject of dealing with Russia, especially on sanctioned entities. Is there any basis to suggest there be tilt east of Putin post-2014 was related to the question of sanctions, or where the looming sanctions today impact somehow on the way Russia is dealing with China? Namely, is there a grain of truth in that Macron assertion?
Yeah,
thank you.
Okay. Well, the short answer to that would be read my piece in National Interest about this, where I take on this argument and I define the fallacy of triangulism. There are too loose, I think, analogies made between the strategic triangle today between Russia, the United States and China, and the sort of 1970s détente, as if America then, in the 1970s, finds its counterpart in Russia today. There's some sort of transposition of this logic, and it's better to be à deux in a world of three powers and so on. I think that analogy just fails, and I set out the argument there. But to just say a few words about that now. I think Russia, Russia's move towards the East and towards China in particular, to some degree preceded 2014. You see elements of it when Putin returns in 2012 for his third term. Never very plausible, really, certainly not to Asia. It's been accelerated, I think, in a world where the relationship with the West collapsed. from Crimea onwards. But again, because Russia has been forced to accelerate its movement in that direction, and Russia is now more the demandeur in the relationship, it's something that China finds it easier to define on its terms. And I think in some more thoughtful Russian circles, there is an unspoken, for the most part, anxiety about, for all of the effusive public face and respect that Xi gives Putin on the many occasions that they meet, if you look at the details of the agreements that are actually reached, there is, one sees in that a reflection of the underlying power and the relative need of the two for the relationship. Specifically in economics, I think, and if we're talking about sanctions, then it's partly about the economic relationship that we should think. I believe that in many respects that's the least significant strand, least secure strand of the relationship as it's developed. Yes, there's more gas being sold, of course, but China has other options there, actually, particularly in the world of the current gas glut that we live in. More projects coming on stream in Australia and so on. And yes, at working level, the quiet anxieties and frustrations and difficulties the Chinese find, the hostility at local level they find in Russian officials, and the resentments and so on, are powerful constraints indeed. I think the more significant forms of cooperation we find are cooperation on some security issues, particularly in the cyber domain, actually, and some of the cooperation, some of the fora that have been developed there. In a sense, all that was overdue anyway. The surprise is it happened so late. You have the biggest energy producer in the world with the biggest energy consumer in the world sharing the longest border in the world. None of this happened earlier, and it really should have. So there was always going to be an inevitable catching up. What I don't think it's fair to say is that it's Western sanctions that, in some sense, are responsible for creating a situation that would not otherwise have existed. The other part of the Macron argument I find still less logical is the proposition that Russia is weak. That's part of the argument. Russia is weak and needy, and therefore the West should become closer to it. That doesn't make sense. If it's Russia that's the weak party, it's Russia who should be making the movement, not the West. So that part of the equation, I confess, totally eludes me. And finally, even if you did want to maintain the argument that Western sanctions were, in some sense, responsible for creating a less desirable strategic situation, and I don't accept that premise, but even if you did, it begs all the questions about why sanctions were imposed in the first place. To simply say the solution is to end sanctions. Surely the solution is for Russia to cease the pattern of unacceptable activity that made them necessary in the first place.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Gentleman there. Yes, you who's pointing to himself. Yes. I'm sorry, could I ask you just to say who you are and where you're from? And I'm sorry for not knowing your voice.
I work for another think tank, the one from whom you stole my most brilliant researcher, Nigel Gould-Davies. I work for Chatham House. Nigel, eloquent as ever. And what struck me in your presentation, Nigel, is your overall admiration for what sanctions have actually achieved, the unprecedentedness of it all. And I accept that, of course. But you must, and you did allude to, but I'd like you to elaborate on, if you may, that in certain areas sanctions are still febrile. They have loopholes. They are weak. Plenty of Russian oligarchs operate with impunity in London. Russians can still host international prestigious sporting tournaments, etc., etc., etc. So my question is to where do you see weakness, and to what do you attribute that febrileness, if you like, in the sanctions regime? Because if, as you say, the Russians have, up to an extent, learnt to adapt to the regime, then the corollary of that, I suppose, is that it's going to need an incremental increase, the sort that you predict. And that suggests to me that there's a certain amount of loophole closing needs to happen. So Why do you see it not happening, or perhaps you see it going happening, people are keeping their powder dry? Where would you go with this?
So I think Russia as a whole has sought to adapt, but as I see it, those adaptation measures are not effectively mitigating the sanctions. We are in a world where even the existing sanctions, and particularly the earlier sectoral sanctions, the first wave that were introduced, are imposing steady cumulative costs on the system. But your question really is about those more recent sanctions on individuals, including individuals, again, not directly associated either with the making or the implementation of policy. And those are still fairly new, and there is a sense of so commercialists talk about price discovery, and I think we should talk about policy discovery. There's been a kind of a groping, a feeling, an evolution of sort of thinking and understanding. It reminds me of what Bismarck said about not wishing to know how laws and sausages are made, and one might say sanctions policy either. Policies and sausage can both be delicious, but you don't want to see how they're made. And, I think the sanctions that are emerging are increasingly effective, even if the path by which we've arrived at them has been a little sort of erratic and zigzag at times. So, yes, they're partial and they have holes and loopholes and limitations, partly because they're new. I mean, this represents something quite sort of experimental and innovative. So don't expect too much from them too soon. So your question perhaps is, maybe it casts as the future. What might constrain them from becoming more significant and systematic? And what might make it difficult for us to reach a situation where it is systemically difficult for elites from Russia, but also from other authoritarian states, actually, to enjoy large unfettered access to wealth protection services. And part of the answer to that, I think, lies in some of the interests in Western countries who have benefited from those relationships, frankly, and who, in maybe some in the room, I don't know, in finance and property and aspects of the legal system as well, who have done very well out of their relationship with these very, very wealthy clients, and may enjoy positions of formal or informal political influence, able to shape or express their views in an influential way about what sort of measures should or shouldn't be applied. So I think, again, if we're looking at this aspect of sanctions policy, it's not only outward facing, it's not only a matter of what measures might we impose on other countries, it's what are our own domestic governance arrangements.
Nigel, I have to ask, do you think jurisdictional arbitrage should be closed down, not just with respect to money, but to other banking services, luxury goods and public schools?
I think ultimately it's all about illicit money. So, for example, the schools, if I see no principled reason why people should not be allowed to send their children to schools in the West, for example, as long as there is confidence and reliability in the provenance and probity of the wealth that makes that possible. It would be an argument like that. Ultimately, it's about how the money is made, the sources of that, and in particular, if it comes as a consequence of illicit or dubious ties, relationships with authoritarian regimes, especially those that threaten our values.
Thank you. Neil.
Neil Brown, I'm a member of IRS. First of all, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. When the sanctions were imposed in 2014, the price of oil was $100 a barrel, and it's now half of that. And with the slowdown in China, there is going to be an increasing oil glut as well as gas glut, and with coronavirus, it's something more than that. So these low oil prices are going to be with us for a long time to come. Yeah. My understanding is that Russia's fiscal break-even is $45-50 a barrel.
Yes.
So with that in mind, and to what extent will this would low oil for the last 5 years have amplified the effect or changed the strategy for the imposition of sanctions, and how might it impact on futures, either in terms of Russia's behaviour in the Crimea, which endures, or indeed Putin's behaviour domestically to position himself to stand power?
Yes. So Russia's economy is underperforming in global context. Not only, although Putin has said he wants the Russian growth rate to exceed the global average, it's doing worse even than the Western average at the moment, let alone the global average. Sanctions only play a small role in that. And you're absolutely right. If one is looking for sources of lower economic growth, the oil price is a much more important variable. And people have done clever work disentangling the effect of the IMF and others, disentangling the effects of the oil price fall that you describe from the sanctions that began to be applied to it at the same time. It all says that, yes, it's the oil price that has a much more significant brute macroeconomic impact on economic growth. And again, it reminds us that the purpose of sanctions themselves has not been to impose, in the way that sanctions used to in the past, brute, crude, sort of gross economic pain on the country as a whole. These have been much more targeted and much more precise. But yes, Russia has had to respond to that. It's done well. I think it's not an easy task to essentially halve the budget clearing oil price in 3 or 4 years, as they have done. It's imposed constraints. Their very, very fiscally conservative policy has stood them in good stead. Putin has always been a fiscal conservative from when he took office. And recall, it was only 2 years before he did so. It was back in 1998 that Russia defaulted on its loans. Humiliation, actually. And I think part of that lesson was absorbed by him and by others, a determination never to put Russia in a position of fiscal vulnerability where that sort of humiliation is possible again. So we've seen this consistency in the management of public finances. Of course, if the oil price continues to fall, and yes, look at coronavirus, look at the impact it's having on Chinese domestic flights, for example, that would require further, more painful adjustment. At exactly the time when the new Prime Minister coming in, they are talking again about national projects, about putting more money into the economy, drawing down these large fiscal surpluses that they've accumulated. So, yes, it remains, in terms of overall economic performance and overall macro strategy, the oil price remains by far the most important variable. And you have this fascinating situation where a great power asserting itself in pretty adversarial ways remains very, very dependent on this single variable over which it has no control. So, and I mentioned Bismarck and Laws and Sausages earlier. Another of my favourite Bismarck sayings about Russia: Russia is always stronger and weaker than you think. And I think that's both, in many, many ways, that sort of paradox is worth sort of exploring politically and economically and socially and so on.
Thank you very much. I think the gentleman there had his hand up first. Yes.
Craig Alden, Foreign Policy Centre, and I'll just echo thanks, Nigel, for the compelling and insightful analysis and overview you've given us. I think, looking at some of the effects and impact on Russia and your reference to issues around capital outflows, I wondered if you could actually say a bit more specifically about capital flight from Russia. Obviously, a long-term challenge in the post-Soviet period, but particularly in the last 5-6 years and the context of sanctions, do you see capital flight having increased? And what effects, if any, have there been from Putin's decree, as again you alluded, for the repatriation of funds held by Russian elite wealth holders abroad? Be very interested in your comments on that.
So capital flight, usually large annual aggregates of capital flight, has been a near constant feature of the post-Soviet period, as you know. Only 2 years since the breakup of the Soviet Union, where that has not been the case. And that issue has been exacerbated since Crimea. So 2018, the year of Salisbury, the year of the more severe personal sanctions, saw a jump, immediately after, the month after that, a jump in capital outflows, and that year saw the fourth highest annual outflow in the whole post-Soviet period. So that, to me, demonstrates the acute sort of sensitivity of elite opinion to the prospects of tightening sanctions. And the point you make about these outflows, despite Putin's repeated calls for repatriation, people to be patriotic and invest their money in Russia, says something interesting about the limits, I think, of Putin's control over elite behavior. And it's at least a partial corrective to, or a caveat to, the suggestion that elites are simply cowards. More generally, people, as 2024 begins to approach, people are talking more and more now about the role, the influence, the infighting between different parts of the elite system within Russia. And I think this is absolutely right. It's not wrong, of course. It's important to pay attention to what mass opinion is thinking and how it's behaving and how it's trying to organize itself. But in practice, in Russia, I think in most systems across space and time, sort of fundamental feature about how change works, change of a significant kind almost always begins within regimes and not from below. So it's elite opinion, elite behavior, those things at which we must look. And yes, so Putin, as you know, has repeatedly said, bring your money back, being quietly ignored, honoured in the breach.
Yeah, very good, thank you. Well, lots of people want to ask. I'm going to take the lady at the back first.
Hi, I'm Ravais from UCL. So you mentioned the cryptocurrency that Russia is trying to develop, and China is also setting a very large-scale national platform on digital payment, the DSAP. I'm just wondering, what do you think will be the most direct and indirect impact to the West economy, and also how will the West respond in a way?
Yeah. It's a very interesting question. It's a more technical question than I may be equipped to answer. Not being a crypto expert and not wishing to pretend to be one, I could waffle an answer, but I'll be honest. So I think in terms of the whole sanctions debate and the prospect for the evolution of sanctions regime, we are seeing crypto create new opportunities for sanctions evasion. That's the key point. And there are reliable reports that Russia is actively cooperating with other countries in order, so it's not just doing this on its own. Of course, if it's a medium of exchange, it needs to have arrangements in place with other countries to do that. So, and there are more thoughtful sort of sanctions commentators who say, well, be careful how you apply sanctions. Don't over-apply them or apply them to too many targets at the same time in particular, or you will incentivize further innovation in this field. You will incentivize responses to your own escalation, and the evaders at some point may get the upper hand. They may be able effectively and credibly to conduct transactions which are simply effectively untraceable and therefore unsanctionable. There are risks for them to do so, of course, with the might and the structural power of the dollar being as formidable as it is, and indeed having been burnished as a consequence of recent sanctions against Russia. But in terms of the sort of technical aspects of how feasible that would be, you need a crypto, there may be one in the room, I don't know, a crypto expert or specialist to address that. But it's a very good question that I think we wait an answer to.
Thank you. Yes, the first hand that went up, the back gentleman with glasses, two in. That's.
Hi, I'm Alex Rose, I'm an election observer with OSCE. I wonder if you can comment further on the 2024 question. You alluded to it. Given President Putin's press conference in the middle of January. How do you think that will play on the elites? Do you think they will be reassured, or do you think they'll be further scared about sanctions going on for some time to come?
Yes, there are different. Elites plural is exactly right, of course.
The different sections.
Yeah, and people are writing some interesting things about this now, and they're making important distinctions between them and talking about the tensions, the growing tensions between some of the key groups there. In respect of Putin's recent statements and the constitutional amendments that will follow, very significant for the development of the Russian constitutional order, of course, and ultimately how the 2024 question will be resolved. There are a lot of sort of hot takes, of course, on immediate sort of commentary on what all this means. To me, there are still sort of lingering questions about how exactly that will work. I'm not completely sure that the Kremlin knows itself exactly, and there were certain tensions even within the speech. On the one hand, and this was the weight of much of the commentary, yes, moving powers away from the presidency towards the Duma. On the other hand, Putin is very specific and clear that Russia has to remain as a strongly presidential republic. So there are elements of sort of difference and tension, and I think ambiguity. So we haven't seen the end of this at all. But to your question specifically about the extent to which these constitutional shifts might affect elite attitudes towards sanctions, ultimately I think that's conditioned more by their concerns about sort of Western policy, and especially what the US Congress is cooking up. And also some other measures in the pipeline as well. The US Corporate Transparency Act, which is now going through Congress. The implications of that for anonymous beneficiary ownership will be significant. The full implementation of the EU 4th and 5th money laundering directives as well, especially the 5th one, will be significant too. So if the question is about elite concerns of future sanctions, I think it's more in the first instance about Western policy. But again, Western policy is a consequence of and a response to Russian actions. So concerns about Western policies and the growing Western hindrances to the enjoyment of oligarchic or administrative arbitrage, they really, if you follow the logic, they are ultimately questions about what Russian policy will be. I charted out very briefly earlier the ways in which Western sanctions policy has escalated. At each point, it's escalated in response to specific Russian actions. And had you not had Salisbury, for example, it's quite likely, certainly very possible, you would have seen an erosion of especially the EU sanctions regime. As you know, that has to be renewed every 6 months, unanimously. Not an easy thing to do. I think there's a lot of surprise that cohesion has been maintained up till now. And if Russia hadn't taken actions which made the case for maintaining and even enhancing them very, very plausible, you would have seen some falling away. So then the question becomes, in the eyes of at least some elites, can we, in any significant way, influence the course or outcome of the 2024 issue in ways that will make it less likely that Russia will behave in ways that prompt an escalation in Russian sanctions?
Right. Thank you very much. Yes, gentlemen.
Hi, I'm Zaid from LSE. I want to ask you about, as you know, the Normandy summit is happening now, with Angela Merkel, Macron, Putin, and Zelensky. Can Putin link the negotiations with the resolution of Donbass with lifting EU sanctions against Russia? Is that a strategy that Putin might consider?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and indeed the initial sanctions that were imposed in 2014, 2015 were pretty explicit in that respect, that if Russia were to fully and credibly and completely implement the Minsk agreements, then they would be lifted. So the question is what that would look like, how the EU would assess that. Could Russia credibly commit, demonstrably do what it has not done up to now? That would be a shift. In fact, if anything, even in the last few days, we've seen, seems to me, on the ground, a movement away from that. We've seen a significant escalation. But if that were to happen, we'd be in different territory. It would suggest that the ordering of Putin's priorities in some way has changed. But to your point about EU actions, it would be, I think, a significant test of EU cohesion. Now, some might take the view that, yes, though that earlier 2014-2015 understanding remains in force, and there's now a case for lifting sanctions. Others might think, well, more has happened since then, and therefore more might be required. One variable sort of hanging over all of this, we don't yet know how it will play out, of course, is that the EU is slightly smaller now from what it was when the original sanctions position was formulated. So what will Britain's post-Brexit sanctions strategy be? It's been one of the strongest proponents of sanctions, of course. It's been one of the spine-stiffening forces within the EU. And how, once Britain has defined its position on these issues, how will it cooperate, how will it engage with the EU on these issues? Will there be the same degree of close coordination, something comparable to the consistency and degree of British influence that we saw when Britain was an EU member?
Great, thank you. Any more questions? Yes, at the back there.
Great question from European Institute. So my question regards to the energy security. So I also mentioned this in the survival, and so my question is, they have a rare choices for you to reduce the dependence on the Russia's energy, and mainly natural gas, also the solar field and the petrol. So my question is, from long-term perspective, how you and the Western Balkan states, mainly Serbia and Bosnia, to figure this out, to search the alternative options or diversify their suppliers to reduce the dependence on Russia's energy imports.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
So yes, I mean the direction of travel of EU energy policy over the past decade or so has been to seek, of course, greater diversity and therefore security of supply. It's not only a matter of finding different supplies. It's about significantly liberalising the EU's own domestic energy arrangements, creating the interconnectors, renegotiating with contracts with Gazprom, forcing, it's a maybe an underappreciated success story, sort of the slow strength of the EU, forcing Gazprom to revise some of its arrangements, to take or pay arrangements, it's the prevention of selling on gas to third parties and so on. EU is in a much better place than it was before. There's still some way to go yet, but I think that the EU has introduced in its energy policy a healthy degree of flexibility that has made it less vulnerable. And I remember quite vividly, because I was in Moscow at the time, one of the key moments that began to prompt this rethinking. So I was at the embassy. I was heading the economic division there, and I was given responsibility for G8 work in 2006. So this was Russia's first chairmanship, as it turned out last, because it then later removed from the G8, chairmanship of the G8. The moment where he's not only at the top table, but chairing the top table. It was sort of a significant moment for the country. And so what were Russia's top priorities in its G8 presidency? Every country has a set of priorities. The most important was energy security. That was going to be the major theme of its G8 presidency, to sort of define and propagate and instill its own view about how security in energy issues should work. And particularly, it talked a lot of the time about security of demands, not just security of supply. So the arguments for long-term contracts. And I remember literally on day one of January the 1st, 2006, day one of its first G8 presidency, priorities, energy security, turning off attacks to Ukraine, with the downstream consequences that it had for parts of Europe. And that was a kind of wake-up moment for Europe. It brought forward by at least a decade a debate about the wisdom of ever greater dependence on Russian supplies. And it was at that point, and some points like it soon after, we began to get this, again, it's slow strength. The EU supertanker can turn slowly, but when it turns, my goodness, it turns. It can be quite unstoppable. Yeah, I think there's been important progress there, but there's still more to do.
One more question. Right at the back. Thank you.
Steve Osborne, King's College London. So the impossibility of acting through the UN, with Russia being on the Security Council, perhaps it arguably forces like the EU and the US to act separately or in isolation. And it also deprives the public and private sectors of the benefits of reporting and coordination from panels of experts. So do you perceive the lack of such a sort of coordinating and reporting body, or indeed do you see an opportunity for such a thing?
On sanctions issues specifically?
Sanctions on Russia.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you draw attention to that, because of course that's another way in which Russia is one further way in which Russia has been a challenging sanction target. There is no global sort of consensus on the need to sanction it, unlike previous sanctions regime on smaller countries. It's not just that Russia, of course, is a permanent member. China is, emphatically not part of the sanctions regime, although it has been deterred from certain transactions with Russia as a consequence of fear of American secondary sanctions on China. On the matter of coordination, I've been broadly impressed by the consistency of purpose of America and the EU. Within the EU itself, which is an achievement, but also between the EU and the United States. Now, they have not all imposed the same measures at the same time in the same way. There have been measures particularly which America has imposed, which the EU has not. There are elements of difference, but not of antagonism or contrast in the sanctions regime. There's been a broad and impressive consistency of purpose and application. And it goes beyond the matter of specific economic measures, but I mean, no more impressive moment, I think, than, again, the coordinated expulsion of Russian intelligence operatives from many, many countries, even beyond the West, in fact, around 150 or so. That, to me, was a sort of signal moment of sort of demonstrating consistency of purpose and approach to this. The question now is whether that common front will continue, or whether there'll be challenges to it. We've already discussed one from within the EU, the President Macron. There are questions now about Nord Stream 2, and at least whether that will create antagonisms between America and some, not all, some EU members. So moving forward from this, I think a key variable is the extent to which that shared view about the importance of sanctioning Russia in quite specific ways will endure or not. That will be a real test, I think, over the next year or two. Yes.
Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform. I wanted to come back to the question of adaptation, Nigel. Putin, of course, claims that sanctions have been a great success for Russia because import substitution has been so good and so on. And certainly Russian agriculture seems to be doing quite well on the back of it. But do you see any sign that in the more kind of technological areas, I mean, you're talking about the reliance of Russia on Western oil and gas technology for some areas at least. Do you see any signs that Russia is actually developing or stealing the technology that it no longer can access from, Schlumberger or Halliburton?
Yeah. Oh, first on import substitution in agriculture, it's certainly been a great boom for Russian producers of the, it's brinza not brie now for Russians. No, and of course some of them have done very well in the agro complex. When people talk about recent successes in Russian agriculture, the first thing they usually point at is wheat. And Russia has become phenomenally successful as a wheat producer and exporter. That's not something that can be attributed to sanctions, however, because wheat was not a sanctioned food product. So it's worth making that distinction. And so, in a sense, that success is sort of overdue, a consequence of dealing with the frankly awful Soviet legacies in agriculture. Recall, before the First World War, parts of Russia, including then Ukraine, were the breadbasket of Europe, and by the 1960s, the Soviet Union a net grain importer and so on. So the awful sort of systemic damage done to Russian agriculture takes time to sort of shuffle off, and we're seeing that natural potential being released now, but not, again, specifically attributable to import substitution following sanctions. On Russia's ability to innovate and develop the technologies in other sectors deprived it by sanctions, so oil and gas in particular, and defence as well, I think it's more difficult there. We're certainly seeing efforts, but we're seeing projects slow down, some being suspended. Never underestimate the resourcefulness, of course, or the innovative capacity of Russians. It's truly impressive. But in the shorter term, I don't see some of those fundamental problems being solved. No, and I think it will have it is already having impact on accelerating the relative decline of Russia and the sort of poor productivity record and so on. I see no easy fix for that.
Thank you. Time for one more question? Yes, gentleman there.
Henry Wingfield from Barclays Private Bank. You mentioned how the elites in Russia, one of their motivations to potentially change Russian policy would be to preserve their capital offshore. Do you see any other motivations that the elites in Russia might have to change Russian policy other than protecting their wealth overseas?
Overseas, yes, which we've long done in very significant sort of numbers, of course. Well, okay, so what? Interesting. So think about the oligarchic bargain. It's effectively been struck and been a defining feature of Russia's political economy since around 2000 or so, or soon after Putin had his rapid reckoning with the oligarchs, yes, either imprisoned them or cowed them or expelled them. So what does that look like? So you've had the situation of, as it were, sudden weakness and dependence, but deeper or closer relationships with the West, burnishing reputations, seeking to be accepted in the West, enter Western society, and part wealth there safely. If that comes under threat, what are the options? One is to jump ship and just go and move to the West and live in the West and in fact become exiles. That's never a popular option. You're sort of cutting yourself off from access to your own culture, your background, your homeland and so on. A few have done that, but not many. I don't expect any more to do that. A second option is to cut your losses by returning back to Russia, to doing what Putin wants them to do, and few of them have done so far, which is repatriate their wealth. Russia is not now a safer place to do that than it has been before. If anything, I think it's become potentially more dangerous to do that. So a third would be to find non-Western jurisdictions that might be safer than Russia, but more available than the West now becomes. So what does that look like? Singapore, Hong Kong, something like that? Are there other jurisdictions that will not sanction Russia, but could be attractive, or at least acceptable places for them to send their wealth? Interesting question. The little things I see suggest that actually there's growing interest in Singapore in particular. But whether that can be done on a large scale, I think is just too soon. But the underlying point is that there is a dilemma here and a worry that this group has not faced before.
Nigel, thank you. Any more questions? if not, just a word of thanks to you, Nigel, for a fantastically insightful and rich presentation on this subject. And I was struck in particular by your typology of sanctions, suggesting that some of them were indeed originally reversible. I wouldn't say that they're looking irreversible, but perhaps non-reversible, and the air of permanence that settled around sanctions as an instrument is, I'm sure, going to bring us all back together sooner or later to talk about this again. But until then, Nigel, thank you very much indeed.